Welcome, pen pals. I have a special treat for you. I'm going to test all of these beautiful Omas fountain pen nibs. That's right, we're going to get a complete overview of the Omas nib size comparisons from extra fine all the way through broad, and a special Kodachi nib, which is now becoming available, as well as the Doppio and Doppio Invertido. So join me as I get a fun chance to ink and play with all of these pens. Okay, so for this pen test, I inked every one of these pens with Waterman Serenity Blue. And if you've seen the YouTube channel before or seen me on social media, usually any of the new pens that we use and test, I usually use with Waterman Serenity Blue. Why that? Because it's a very, very safe ink. It's easy to clean out. It's a very nice bright blue, and I think that if you're just going, especially if you're starting out, you want a nice multi-purpose blue that's business appropriate and easy to clean out of your pens, you really can't beat Waterman Serenity Blue. So I put it in each of these various Omas pens, and you might notice a couple of tried and true favorites that are here, like the Ogiva, as well as the Paragon, which is now available in this awesome, beautiful Grigio Perla celluloid, as well as a frosted demonstrator, and the new Rosewood Ebonite calligraphy type pen, which has a unique finial, and it's also the Paragon model as well. And this has got that special Doppio and Doppio Invertido nib, which is pretty wild. You'll have to see that. It's a stacked nib. So we shall go through the range. We'll start off with the finest of the fine, which is extra fine, and then we'll get crazier as things go along. So extra fine has, of course, the finest of the lines that you could expect out of the Omas nib range. The nib itself has a tactile feel. It does give a little bit of some feedback, but I would not say anywhere near as some of the, let's say, sailor feedback that some people might be used to that is quite rough. It is still pretty smooth even for an extra fine nib, which is something I would expect out of a European or European-made extra fine, but the line width on the European extra fines are not as precise as, let's say, the Japanese extra fines would be, which you would expect from Sailor. The nib responsiveness, though, is pretty nice. It does have a little bit of some bounce to the nib. There's a little bit of pliability on the downstroke, but not too much, and definitely not in the realm of flex nibs. It does keep up pretty nicely with some quicker writing, though on the up diagonal strokes it was a little bit light, so the ink flow is not, even though it has an ebonite feed, the ink flow is not exceptionally wet on this extra fine, but that's something that probably people who write with extra fine would come to expect, because they don't really want a wet gusher of a nib anyway. You really want a very tight, controlled line. So next up we have fine point. Fine point, I feel, has a lot less feedback. I would say not a lot less, but the fine point has definitely less feedback than the extra fine does. Also feels like the line weight is significantly thicker than with the extra fine, and gives a bit more of the ink on the page as well. It just seems to flow a bit more liberally than the extra fine does, especially comparing the diagonal upstrokes that are there, and also the reverse writing sample seems to provide a little bit more ink on the page than the extra fine does. So this is what I would feel would be more of a general purpose writing nib, especially if you can't really necessarily control the paper quality that you write on, where it really gives a nice balance of the smoothness and the tighter line width, with a little bit more of that ink flow. I think that if you don't want the super fine, this is Fine Point's a really nice general purpose nib that's good for a variety of different papers. Next we have a medium point written with an Omas Paragon. Now, any of the Omas pens that you find, the modern Omas pens that you'll find on the website, they are all made with a 14 karat gold nib. So despite the fact that the Paragon does cost a lot more than a standard ogiva does, the Paragon is still made with the same nib and feed as with the other models of Omas pens. Now the medium point, especially looking at the Quick Brown Fox, the Pangram that I wrote there, lays down significantly more ink. It's a wet nib for sure. And in order to be able to handle this amount of ink, I feel you would definitely have to consider your paper quality. And this is Rhodia 80 GSM dot grid paper. It's going to be able to handle the broader nibs in this range. But if you write with anything that is less quality paper, this type of wet writing nib is going to be hard for that paper to handle. So, but I mean, with the line width is of course greater than the fine and the extra fine, but definitely you can notice as the nib sizes get bigger, also the flow gets more generous and the smoothness is also there as well. Although this one just has just a slight hint of feedback still. It is much glassier than the fine and extra fine, which I mean still gives a nice tactile feel to the page, especially if I'm writing with a paper like Rhodia, which tends to be on the smoother side anyway. It's nice to have like a little bit of that tactile feedback as you're writing that's not glass on glass and it's just super squeaky. But the medium is very, very liberal with the amount of ink that's on here, and you're just going to definitely need to calibrate yourself with the paper quality, which is usually not a problem for most pen enthusiasts. That you also have like pretty good paper qualities, like anything that's Japanese paper, Rhodia, Clairefontaine. Those are usually really good for this type of nib and above. And here we have the broad, which feel almost like we jumped a size. We went from it's like we went from a size 8 shoe to a size 12 in a hurry, because this nib is laying down massive amounts of ink. It has a very, very bold line. Now, any of these nibs are capable of reverse writing, as you had seen in the handwriting samples, and it's particularly useful, I think, in a broad nib like this, just in case you do need to flip back and be able to use this pen on paper that might not be able to handle this much ink on it. Now this is not meant to be a flex nib, so of course if I'm pressing a little bit and the tines open up, it's not really meant to be opened up so much. So as I was doing little figure eights there, yeah, you get some railroading because it's really not meant for that sort of thing. But just to test it out and see what's going on there. But yeah, this broad gives a lot of coverage with ink. It lays down a lot, so you could see more of the shading and sheen, if there was sheen, which there is a little bit in Serenity Blue. This is a great nib for if you're writing in your own journal and you love experimenting with different types of inks that will provide those additional properties like shading, sheen, and shimmer. They highlight and accentuate them because there's just so much of the ink on the page. And the smoothness also on this nib is much, much greater than the 3 previous nibs because you have such a huge ball of tipping material on this broad nib, and the ink flow allows for such a smooth delivery on the page that feels great. I mean, it just has such a nice satiny smooth feel about it. Now for something new and specialized, we have the Kodachi nib. Now, but the Kodachi nib is a specialty nib that changes actually the line width based on how you angle the pen. So I'm going to write the Quick Brown Fox 3 different ways just to test this out. So we're going to write it with the pen more of a perpendicular angle to the page and see how that goes. And then we're going to angle it more acutely to the page, maybe like a 45, 50 degree angle. And we're going to try to go a little bit more with the pen closer to the paper and see at a more acute angle how this pen writes. I'll do that again with just straight lines, so I'll do a horizontal line, more perpendicular. Here's like about 50 degree angle. And here's maybe like a 30 degree angle. Try to get even lower here, see as low as we could possibly go. We do a limbo with the pen. So the Kodachi nib originally was created by Yukio Nagahara, and this particular Kodachi grind here is actually completed by Matthew Chen. Is pretty well known through the fountain pen community as a nib meister, nib specialist. And this Kodachi nib provides similar type of writing style as, let's say, a Sailor Zoom nib would, where it does variate based on your angle of the pen to the paper, as you see with the Quick Brown Fox Jumps Over the Lazy Dog. It is quite thinner and tighter, but still has a decent amount of, I think, of ink flow with all 3 writing samples. This has, I feel, of like kind of like an accented sort of thing, as almost like a cursive italic would, where the lines just seem to have a definite character about them and a bit more ink flow than, let's say, the medium point would. The broad seems a little bit more of like a monoline, but this kind of feels a little bit more accented writing with it. So it definitely feels like it adds more character to the writing and a little bit more versatility, being that you could switch up the line widths based on how your pen is writing on the paper, how it's angled on the page. The Kodachi is a specialty nib, part of the Grigio Perla range that is available at a premium. This next one as well is a premium nib. It's only available on the Calligraphia pen, which is this beautiful rosewood ebonite, and the nib is noticeably stacked. So stacked meaning that there's actually 2 layers of 14 karat gold on this pen nib, and they are layered on top of each other. So where the arrow decoration is the Doppio nib has another layer of 14 karat gold metal that overlays on the nib design and then down the slit as well. And what that creates as an effect is an extra large surface at the writing tip. And this surface is curved upward. So this Doppio, this standard Doppio, is curved upward at an angle. So it kind of, and it's very rounded too, so it's not too sharp. And as you'll see with the Invertido, it's going to be completely different. But we'll show you the Doppio first, just to see how this performs. So the Doppio, like the Kodachi, kind of varies based on the angle that you have to the page. So if I want to write the quick brown fox with the nib more at a vertical angle, I'm going to get a very, very fine line. It's super noticeable that I went from a different angle on the first line than the second line. So you would notice that, of course, too, that my horizontal lines are a lot different than my vertical lines. The vertical lines are much, much finer than the horizontals, which seem very broad, almost like I'm using a paintbrush to stroke them. And that's kind of where the Doppio is much different than the Kodachi, because the Doppio is more like an architect style nib that then you could change the width on based on how you hold the nib to the paper. So I could make it a very small horizontal line if I wanted to, or if I really wanted to let it all out there, I can make a very broad horizontal line. But the vertical lines will also change too as you change the position of the nib to the paper. So you could see as I'm making these vertical lines, I'm changing the way that the nib is touching the paper, and it's not as pronounced as the horizontal lines are, but you can notice that there would be a significant difference. And there's also a significant difference in terms of feedback as well, because if I'm writing with the nib up top, very perpendicular to the paper, I feel a lot more of that scritchiness, especially as I was doing the reverse writing sample, feel a lot of that feedback. But as I bring it to that sweet spot down below, as I hold it more acutely to the page, I get a lot more ink flow. I got a lot more smoothness at the bottom of the nib's range there. And now we'll see what the reverse of that is with the Doppio Invertido. So whereas the Doppio had an angle that goes upward, almost like the nose of the nib is kind of pointed up, the nose of the nib is kind of has a hawkish beak on the Invertido and points downward. Still the same design element as far as the stacked nib and the way that the nib is stacked with following the arrow graphic. That's very characteristic of Omas nib design, is that you have that arrow that kind of overlays the top of the nib. This layers the extra gold nib on top of that. So if you could just imagine when you're making this nib, you actually have to use two Omas nibs on one pen. That's why when you look at the Calligraphiae, it's a much more expensive pen than you normally would see from Omas, because they basically have to use two nibs to manufacture just this one nib on this pen. So we're going to take a look at how the Doppio Invertido writes. So the Doppio Invertido, it starts out pretty much like a, let's say, a fine or an extra fine when writing with it in the normal standard position that you normally would write with a fountain pen nib. And then it truly opens up when you decide to go for reverse writing, because then you're catching that broad edge again as you write with the pen. It feels a lot different though than the standard Doppio. It feels more like I'm writing almost with a felt tip marker, like a Sharpie or a chisel tip highlighter. It doesn't feel smooth and have that same ink flow as the Doppio would just writing with it normally. Which, I mean, that might be the point, I feel, of distinction, that you don't necessarily want to have a pen that just basically is the flip side and the reverse of the other. So the Invertido's strengths, I feel, is that if you prefer usually writing in the fine and extra fine realm and would seldomly see yourself writing with that broad edge, that it's more optimized to do the writing this way as a standard way, rather than if you went with the Doppio and by default you're usually writing extremely broadly and with that calligraphic look, and then you would just sometimes be opting for reverse writing. I think if you are looking for an experience that has the versatility of this nib, but you see yourself as a person who would normally write with an extra fine or a fine and wants that control, then the Doppio Invertido is the nib that you would be looking for. But if you're looking for a nib that writes broad all the time, you like a medium or a broad or a stub, then the Doppio is going to be the nib that you want here, because by default it's going to give you that nice broad, very wet architect-like writing style, and then you could always flip it over and then just have it write its reverse writing style, which gives you that very scritchy, very extra fine type of writing experience that the Doppio Invertido has by default. All right, so there you go, pen pals. There's all my chicken scratch to show that we did our Omas nib size comparison. Lots of interesting stuff to take a look at here, not just your normal extra fine, fine, medium, and broad. Lots of interesting things, especially with the specialty nibs that you saw here with the Kodachi and the two Doppio nibs, of which are available on the new special editions that I had mentioned before. You could find any of these at goldspot.com. We offer all of the modern Omas fountain pens, including the new special editions, and some new things that they're always looking to come up with to which I could really appreciate is Omas really tries to accomplish a fine writing instrument that just looks pretty, but also writes in a beautiful manner as well, and that accommodates to your needs as a writer. So I feel as a person who enjoys stub nibs, enjoys flex nibs, enjoys Italian and Japanese nibs, I enjoy all sorts of different nibs, and I think these Omas 14 karat gold nibs are some really great quality nibs that offer something that you don't really see so often, I think, in the premium pen market, which is a really beautifully wet writing pen. I know there's a lot of other Italian brands too, and I love them as well. But these also give you a little bit something extra, I think, especially with those specialty nibs. Check them out at goldspot.com. And if you're interested in more nib size comparisons, I have a couple of videos for you that you could take a look at. One is an Esterbrook nib size comparison, which also has specialty type nibs you could look at, or also we have a Lamy Safari nib comparison as well, which I think gives you great basis, especially for beginners, to understand where you could enter in to the fountain pen realm and get something that accommodates well to your handwriting style. So thank you for watching, and stay inky, my friends. Take care.